Estimated at over 50,000 people, Melbourne's Jewish population is Australia's largest. Today, in 2019, that population is changing. Post-war migrants are passing on. New migrants from Israel and the former Soviet Union are arriving, and the suburb of Caulfield, the cultural and spiritual centre of Jewish Melbourne, is regenerating. This is People on the Move for Plus 61J. We're exploring the past and present trends for Melbourne's Jewish community. We're asking, what's the future of the city's bagel belt? We're starting where it all began, the city of St Kilda. For a century, Jews in Melbourne were divided between the city's working class inner north and its comfortable Bayside inner south. By the mid-20th century, that all changed as a generation of post-war migrants and refugees headed southwards to the suburb of St Kilda.
So after the war, they really moved here in quite large numbers, and then they started to open their own shops, the delicatessens and the cafes, and the little market that was at the top end of Ackland Street, near Barclay Street. There were a lot of Jewish little stalls there.
Judith Buckrich is a historian of St Kilda. She says post-war Jewish arrivals quickly found themselves at home in the suburb of St Kilda.
Initially, there was just that kind of lovely thing where you could walk to wherever you wanted to walk. Everyone was close by, living in flats. There was a sense of community here, in the same way that Lygon Street was for the Italians. You know, they just could feel at home and be here. And it was a very attractive place and cheap, you know, just it was so cheap. It just cost next to nothing to live here.
By 1961, the city of St Kilda was home to nearly 7,000 Jews, making it the largest Jewish local government area in Victoria. John Zalesnikov was one of thousands of post-war Jewish refugees whose family initially settled in Melbourne's north, but eventually, by the 1950s, moved to St Kilda.
The whole of the Jewish community, which had initially, as we had, lived in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, whether it be Carlton or Brunswick or Moreland or Coburg, moved south of the Yarra. And even the communal organisations, and the best known of them being the Kadema, which had been in Lygon Street, Carlton, moved to Elsternwick.
Post-war arrivals opened cafes, restaurants, delicatessens, and cake shops. John's parents, Avram and Masha Zalesnikov, opened one of the street's best loved, at number 99 Cafe Scheherazade.
People, you know, who had really had a shattering experience during the war, found that they could go there and virtually sit there all day, you know, have a bit of soup or have a bit of something to eat, have a cup of tea. People would come and go and sit with you.
Scheherazade was a variety of different things for different people. Okay, there were the people who came in at 11 o'clock every morning and had their coffee. Maybe they had a second or a third, but they only had a coffee. And then they went home and had dinner at home, and that was their socialising.
Cafe Scheherazade was one of several hubs in Jewish St Kilda. The other was the infamous Jewish Parliament.
But it was a place where on Sundays and other days Jews would simply congregate there, and everything was open for discussion. They'd talk about anything and everything under the sun, from politics to sport to what have you, and that's how it became known as the Jewish Parliament, colloquially speaking. And I think that the cultural element of the Jewish community did, to an extent for some Jews, replace the synagogue experience, particularly for those who had enormous difficulty coming to terms with what had happened during the war and trying to reconcile, I suppose, their faith and their Jewish identities.
By the late 1970s and 1980s, the area's Jewish population had started to decline significantly. Many Jewish families were moving out to the suburbs. They were replaced by students, punks and bohemians, those attracted to the area for its cosmopolitan identity and cheap rent.
people just left. You know, they didn't want to buy an old St Kilda house. They wanted to buy a nice house that had been built sort of recently where they could, you know, have their own home. So people moved out toward Ripponlea, toward Caulfield, toward Elstonwick, all of those areas. And St Kilda slowly started to change. But there was still really, I mean, the restaurants were still here. So there was still quite a presence here until, you know, the end of the 90s. The 1990s kind of finished it.
Like the other Jewish families, the Zalesnikovs also departed, and so too did Cafe Scheherazade.
I noticed a change. It changed because a lot of these people who'd been the frequent customers passed away, and it was their children and their grandchildren who were coming. And yeah, they were coming and they still loved it, but it was less frequent. Okay. And my father was no longer there, so, you know, the cultural activities and the socialisation was nowhere near as strong, and the number of people looking for that food on a regular basis diminished.
Today, St Kilda's Jewish population is estimated to be less than 500, and only one of several Jewish cake shops on Acland Street remains. But despite this, the suburb's shul, now more than 140 years old, continues to survive under the leadership of Rabbi Yaakov Glassman.
The influx of Jews into the Caulfield, East St Kilda area, many of whom had moved away from the St Kilda area, the irony is that although the population and the demographics of the St Kilda precinct, the area, had changed significantly in terms of its Jewish population, the actual congregation itself remained quite strong.
Rabbi Yaakov says the congregation has had to adapt to keep up with Melbourne's changing Jewish population and their needs.
The St Kilda Shul is very cognizant of the fact that there are many, particularly in the younger Jewish community, who don't see the synagogue services as a central part of their lives, and for that reason we have very much diversified the offerings of the St Kilda Shul, where our primary focus and objective, and I suspect it's the same with many other shuls as well, is to transition the shul from simply a synagogue to a community centre. And by that I mean to create as many touch points around the congregation as possible, which could be draw cards to young people.
And while the centre points of Melbourne's Jewish life may long have moved to the suburb of Caulfield, the legacy of 20th century St Kilda Jewish community life remains today.
The effect that the Jewish population had on St Kilda is incredible. Like, it can't be overstated. You know, the cosmopolitan centre of Melbourne became St Kilda, and there's never been anything like it before or since. And I think the feeling remains. You know, the fact that this is, Acland Street is where people who live in other parts of Melbourne come to be tourists. Come down the beach, come down to Acland Street. The cake shops, some of them are still there. It's still got a really good atmosphere, you know. I know people complain endlessly about every development and every change, but it's life, you know. Things have changed.